A single stoppage in a critical maritime artery triggers a mathematical backlog that ripples across the entire global supply chain. Look at the satellite view of the Strait of Hormuz. Every day, roughly 20 million barrels of crude oil and refined products, about a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade, flow through this narrow geographic bottleneck. That reliance extends directly to natural gas. 1/5 of the entire global trade in liquefied natural gas, or LNG, relies on this exact same corridor to reach global markets. LNG is natural gas that has been cooled to a liquid state for easier and safer storage and transport. Markets typically price a disruption here as a straightforward crude oil shock. However, modern supply chains are deeply integrated, allowing localized stoppages to mutate into systemic failures across multiple, seemingly unrelated industries. To understand the true economic threat, we have to look at a 4-vector shock model. This matrix tracks 4 specific simultaneous points of failure: physical supply, logistical friction, finance and insurance, and sanctions. These vectors do not operate in isolation. A failure in one quadrant immediately increases the pressure on the others, bypassing standard buffers. Because a disruption in the Gulf attacks the system from these 4 directions simultaneously, a geographic bottleneck rapidly translates into a global stagflationary crisis, a period of both high inflation and stagnant economic growth. The first vector is the immediate physical supply shock. Within the first 6 months of a disruption, the market reacts to the sudden absence of energy resources. The global oil market has severe limits on short-term elasticity. Because consumption cannot easily drop overnight, removing just 1 million barrels per day from the global supply can drive the price of Brent crude up by $8 a barrel within a year. If a wider regional conflict takes more capacity offline, that math scales aggressively. A severe disruption can quickly push Brent crude past $102 per barrel, extracting deep liquidity out of consuming nations. This photograph shows an LNG carrier loading at a terminal. While oil grabs the headlines, the less substitutable LNG market faces immediate physical limits. Natural gas cannot be easily rerouted, meaning sudden shortages force regional industries to ration their usage almost immediately. This gas rationing directly spikes the cost of electricity generation and drives up overhead for heavy industrial manufacturing downstream. The sheer volume of energy removed from Vector 1 creates an immediate price floor across the global economy, instantly stalling ongoing efforts by central banks to bring down inflation. The second and third vectors are logistical friction and insurance. A waterway experiences de facto closure when it becomes economically unviable to insure the vessels passing through it, even without physical barricades. During a conflict, underwriters apply war risk premiums. These specialized insurance costs can rapidly spike to between 0.7% and 1% of a ship's total hull value for a single voyage, wiping out standard profit margins. Look at this tanker navigating open waters away from traditional choke points. This insurance spike forces a massive logistical pivot, with shipping companies abandoning the Red Sea and the Suez Canal to detour thousands of miles down the coast of Africa around the Cape of Good Hope. To measure the cost of these detours, the industry uses the TEU, or 20-foot equivalent unit. The TEU is the standard metric for shipping container capacity and freight pricing. Longer routes keep ships at sea for weeks, consuming available fleet capacity. The cost per TEU skyrockets, jumping over 256%. This localized shipping friction acts as a direct inflation transmitter, adding roughly 0.6% to the global consumer price index. Logistical friction and skyrocketing insurance premiums act as a multiplier, turning isolated shipping delays into widespread imported inflation for every nation reliant on seaborne trade. Beyond energy and shipping, the conflict triggers hidden shortages. The most acute economic vulnerabilities lie in highly concentrated, low-visibility industrial inputs. The first hidden node is helium. Qatar alone produces approximately 1/3 of the global supply, outputting over 60 million cubic meters annually. This is a medical MRI machine, which requires liquid helium for cryogenic cooling. Removing 5.2 million cubic meters of Qatari helium from the market every month rapidly stalls medical imaging and halts semiconductor fabrication. The second node is the sulfur choke point. Much of the global sulfur trade transits the Gulf, and sulfuric acid is an invisible, strictly required chemical prerequisite for leaching and refining industrial metals. Without steady access to sulfuric acid, the production of copper, cobalt, and nickel stalls, directly threatening manufacturing timelines for electric vehicle batteries and global power grid infrastructure. The third note is petrochemicals. Roughly 84% of the Middle East's export capacity for polyethylene, a foundational industrial plastic, relies entirely on the Hormuz corridor to reach global markets. Disrupting this flow creates invisible inflation and immediate stockouts in low-value but critical goods, freezing assembly lines that depend on items like medical syringes, IV bags, and food packaging. This photograph shows bulk urea. The final hidden node is agriculture, as roughly 18.5 million tons of urea, a highly concentrated nitrogen fertilizer, flows directly through this maritime choke point. An immediate 40% spot price spike in urea forces farmers to reduce application rates. Due to the agricultural lag effect, this translates into lower crop yields and a structural global food price crisis exactly one crop season later. Geopolitics bypasses standard corporate inventory buffers. A disruption in the Gulf directly attacks the foundational inputs required to maintain modern healthcare, technology, and global food security. The fourth vector is sanctions and financial fragmentation. In 2022, the European Union banned certain Russian banks from SWIFT. SWIFT is the global financial messaging network that facilitates secure international money transfers. This provides a baseline for how rapidly these networks can disconnect heavily sanctioned entities from global trade. This is the U.S. Treasury Department, which enforces secondary sanctions targeting foreign third parties that do business with sanctioned entities. The resulting pursuit of shadow fleets transporting illicit oil acts as a profound compliance shock to the global banking system. Banks react to this intense regulatory risk by freezing standard trade finance mechanisms, such as letters of credit, further strangling the ability of merchants to physically move goods. As global risk aversion drives investors toward the security of safe haven assets, the U.S. dollar strengthens. This forces emerging market importers to pay more for energy and commodities priced in that stronger currency, deteriorating their terms of trade and compounding the physical cost of the conflict. When all four vectors fire at once, the aggregate macroeconomic outcome is severe inflation at risk, a scenario where extreme price volatility threatens baseline economic stability. This IMF timeline graph shows a 50% oil shock adding 1.3 to 1.6 percentage points to CPI in year one. Long-term, this compounded friction costs highly exposed importing nations a 0.7 percentage point GDP reduction over 5 years. Two initial scenarios dictate this timeline. A limited attack, measured in weeks, primarily spikes risk premiums but keeps routes operational. A regional war, measured in months, triggers de facto route closures and persistent insurance spikes. The severe scenarios extend the timeline further. A prolonged conflict forces the massive, expensive reshoring of supply chains, while great power escalation results in total systemic financial bifurcation, splitting global trade into isolated blocks. The exact physical destruction matters less than the time frame. The duration of the maritime friction is what cements long-term global stagflation. Surviving this four-vector cascade requires immediate defensive strategy. Governments must prepare targeted fuel buffers and actively avoid cascading fertilizer export bans, which only amplify the risk of global starvation. Supply chain managers must map their Tier 2 and Tier 3 dependencies, specifically identifying their exposure to foundational plastics and industrial gases, and establish multi-hub rerouting plans. Investors must aggressively stress test their portfolios for a simultaneous stagflation environment, a world managing a 50% oil price spike combined with a strong dollar and extreme regulatory risk. In a highly optimized global economy, the hidden interdependencies that cease to function under friction create more damage than any physical destruction.